And we're live. Welcome back, everybody. This is Lockdown Learning Live. I'm Lee. Where's Phil? He's over there. This is Phil. So
everybody.
Me and Phil are hanging out at home. This is my beautiful, beautiful bedroom. And there's Phil's. Unfortunately, we can't be at Sling right now. We both are certified flight instructors at Sling Pilot Academy. Sling Pilot Academy does flight training on a recreational basis, but they also do flight training towards going to the airlines. So there's a little bit of a question mark in the air with everybody who's in aviation of, what's going to happen to the airlines? It sounds like everybody's shutting down, right? And so how does Sling keep going? Well, because of the projected comeback from COVID-19, there's actually a good prospect of the airlines bringing in an uptick in a couple years. So Sling Pilot Academy is preparing for that. So it's actually the perfect time to get into flying because it takes about 2 years to get to the point where you can start transitioning into the airlines. So actually for general aviation and then that pathway towards the airlines, it's a really good time. So cool thing to check out, Sling Pilot Academy. Today, we'll be talking a little bit more about drag. We're talking about induced drag. And the beginning of that is going to be doing some lift review. So we're going to talk about lift again. If you guys are bored of lift already, we'll keep it short for you. And then we'll get into the cool stuff. But we'll talk a little about lift. We will talk about essentially what's holding us back, which is what drag is doing when we're creating lift. And that's what induced drag is. We'll talk about wingtip vortices, and we'll talk about this cool concept of an infinite wing, an infinitely long wing, and what that does conceptually to our induced drag. So let's get rolling here. We're back. All right, cool. Let me pull up my child's drawing here, as always.
By the way, Lee, I liked the intro talking about our rooms. I liked how you talked about your beautiful, awesome, interesting room, and then Phil's room, and then moving on. Thanks a lot.
Well, I mean, I've got a guitar here. There's some foo-foo stuff here and a picture. What do you have, Phil?
I have white paint. Oh, and you have white paint too. Let me guess. Okay, cool. I can't have anything. All right. Anyways.
So here we go. Coming into our induced drag discussion. Again, the things that we're going to go over here, we're going to review lift a little bit. We're going to talk about what's holding us back. Okay, that's kind of what induced drag is. What's holding us back? We're going to talk about wingtip vortices, and then we're going to do a little discussion on an infinite wing. And as you can see here, there's a beautiful depiction of the mythical beast, the infinite wing monster. And I didn't come up with this.
Scary.
It's real. I swear it's real.
So looks like a photograph.
All right. So yeah, that's what we'll be going over today. Anytime we create lift, essentially what's happening here is we're creating some drag. And this is different than the parasite drag we talked about last week. All right. So it's a different type of drag. It's not happening from a form or from the skin of the wing. It's actually created whenever we create lift. All right. So we're going to dive into what creates lift. We've already discussed this, right? It has to do with these pressure differences, but I want Phil to jump in here and kind of dig a little deeper into what actually creates lift on our airplane and what's that going to do that's actually creating some drag.
Yeah, definitely. So, as Lee hands it over, I just wanted to expand more on what he's saying that, as we talked about before, we're talking about this teardrop shaped object that we're going to be flying through the air, right? That airfoil that we're going to be forcing through the air. And as we force this teardrop shaped curved object through the air, we're going to deflect the air around it. And as we deflect the air around it, we cause that air to separate in certain ways and flow over the surfaces of that teardrop in certain ways that cause the air to deflect over that wing. And it's the deflection of that air, and the more we can deflect that air, that causes that lift being the difference in pressure between the lower and the upper surfaces. And we're going to talk today about how in the generation of that lift and in that asymmetry of pressure that we're creating, that is the basis for this induced drag. That is where the drag is coming from, and the airflow patterns that result as a result of the air wanting to equalize. And I think, like, Lee, maybe you could back me up and speak to this. Like, that's just a fundamental, the idea of things of a flow being driven in a certain direction toward things having certain spontaneity and being driven toward a particular direction is just a fundamental property of nature. For example, to go from high pressure to low pressure, like, what is it that's driving this airflow in this direction is just fundamental. It's nothing magical about the wing. It's a property of nature to tend to do this.
Yeah, none of this is really magical. It's all the world trying to balance stuff up. And taking something that we're disturbing and trying to equalize it and make everything in balance. And that's what the world does. We as humans run through and mess stuff up, and then the world just tries to equalize it, and things occur because of that. So that's what lift is just a result of us disturbing some pressure and it trying to equalize.
Exactly. So, Lee, would you mind actually handing that over? I got a really cool video for you guys to look at this process of the airflow wanting to equalize and, the airfoil essentially not letting it, assuming that we can keep that airflow up.
Yeah, Phil, I'm not seeing your screen as an ability for me to throw on there. Are you sharing your screen at the moment?
Oh, let me make sure. Sorry about that. Boom. And then let's go. Cool. All right, there it is. All right.
I should throw up there in a second.
Awesome. Awesome. So what we've got here is something that we've seen before in a previous video, and what it is it's the airfoil going through a wind tunnel test with these oil smoke streaks that represent the smooth flow that Lee's talked about before that we're trying to send over this wing. And what we're finding is that as the air deflects, we've got basically the closer that these streams are to each other, that's representative of the pressure, like the localized pressure in that area. So you're going to see as this, as this angle of attack increases, you see these lines get closer and closer together, representing higher and higher pressure. And what you see is this air being deflected. Let me back this up for us here. This is just a video from a NASA Ames research lab that you guys can go find on your own as well. As this angle of attack increases, we see this air being deflected more and more over this top surface and vacating, and this area on the upper surface being vacated. That represents that low pressure that we see. We've got this high pressure down here, represented by the proximity of the lines, and the low pressure based on the diffuseness of this smoke. The angle of attack increases. The area above the wing becomes more and more low pressure. We know this because the area becomes more vacated. But what I want to, and we've seen this, right? We know that this is what's going on with lift. We know that this is where the pressure differential is. But I really want to turn your attention to, as this angle of attack gets way up. This is a stalled wing, by the way. This is definitely a stalled wing, but this angle of attack is just going to keep going up for the experiment's sake. And you see all of this bubbling and stuff going on. Lee, can you speak to that? And I'm going to back this up for you. But I mean, what is it about what we're looking at that could be contributing to the drag that's holding this airfoil back? It looks like this, is really, this is like swirling and, almost like bubbling diffuse air.
Yeah. Really what's happening here is a mixing of flow. All right, so you have some kind of flow that's nice and smooth, and you can see that on the edges. Nice smooth flow coming over top and under the wing, or even in this flat plate scenario. Same thing. And it doesn't need to be an
Oh, sure.
airfoil.
Yeah. Same thing.
But same thing, the smooth flow getting disrupted. And then as that flow gets disrupted, it's trying to mix. As you can see, as you go further back, the flow does try to become uniform again. That's what the flow is trying to do. It's trying to equalize at the back as well. So all of this drag that we're thinking about, even when you think about the parasite drag that we talked about last time, it's all about disruption and then remixing of flow. We talked about interference drag being two flows mixing and creating drag. So if you think about it that way, then you can kind of conceptualize what's happening here as well. It's just flow trying to mix, and then it just gets all swirly.
Exactly. So that's a really interesting point about lift, and what we're doing is we're seeing the tendency for the high pressure beneath to want to mix with that low pressure up top. So we reviewed a little bit. We just talked a little bit about where lift comes from, and reviewed about where the pressure differential comes from, what it looks like, and just revisiting the idea of air wanting to mix and return to equilibrium as that high pressure wants to seek out that low pressure and equalize. But and that's definitely one way to talk about induced drag, as flow patterns around the airfoil resulting from lift that is essentially the price that we pay for generating lift, right? The flow patterns that come around and circulate around the wing and hold the wing back as a direct result of the lift that we produce, right? It's the idea that we're not going to get something, something at a nothing, it's going to come at a price. But this is another way of looking at induced drag. As we kind of, cap off this lift basics review, can you explain, Lee, kind of like what is it that we're looking at here from an aerodynamic standpoint? What are these arrows, and how does this relate to induced drag specifically?
Sure, yeah, and I actually was drawing right here.
Oh yeah, you want it back?
No, not right now, because I want these technical terms on the screen at the moment, and then I'll come back and simplify it a little bit for you guys. Because cool. For some people that are watching, this may be a little bit too, termy, center of pressure, chord line, angle of attack. Some of these things we have discussed already, okay? But what we need to focus on here when we're talking about the induced drag is the resultant force, the lift, and the relative wind. Okay, if we take a look at those three things, then you can pretty much get an understanding of what's creating some induced drag here. So we all know what lift is at this point. We talked about the pressure trying to equalize, creating the lift. We talked about relative wind in a previous video as well, and that's all about relative motion. So if you look at this picture, essentially this airplane is just moving horizontally. And that's what's creating that relative wind. The airplane just moving horizontally. Now the wing is pointed in a direction that creates the angle of attack, right? So the wing is pointed in a different direction than we're traveling, okay? So that all makes sense. So we're creating relative wind in the way we're going, right? You can see that the lift is directly perpendicular, meaning 90 degrees different. It's going directly up, whereas relative wind is coming directly horizontal. So lift always acts in that direction. And then you see the drag there that creates what's called a resultant vector, or in this case, it's labeled as a force. And what's happening there essentially is because we have lift and drag, it adds to the actual resultant force. All right. So this is vector addition, essentially, or subtraction. Vector math, and you don't have to worry too much about what is a vector. It's just a representation of a force. So a bigger vector is a bigger force, and a smaller vector is a smaller force. So the bigger our arrow is, the more we have, essentially. And if we have a bigger drag vector, then we will have a resultant force that would basically angle over. And I have a little picture that I drew to help conceptualize this a little bit. So
Let's do
Let
it.
me see if I can get us over here. And while I'm transferring over, I'm actually going to leave this with you, Phil. If you wanted to continue while I'm just doing some moving of documents, essentially.
Yeah, no, definitely. Just sticking to this image right here before we go over to Lee, like, yeah, Lee's got it right on. You know, what we're talking about when the generation of lift, and consequently as the in terms of the generation of the induced drag that goes with that lift, we're talking about as we increase this angle of attack, right? We can increase our angle of attack in various ways. We know that we've got movable surfaces on the trailing edges of our aircraft. Some aircraft even have movable surfaces on the leading edges to alter the shape of the angle of attack. But right, we've got this angle of attack that we're going to be using our trailing edge, you know, movable surfaces, whether that be a rudder or an aileron or an elevator or you know, or even if we got a whole stabilator that's moving, we're altering the position of this chord line right here relative to the relative wind that's coming at us in order to change our angle of attack. And as we change that angle of attack, we're changing the amount of airflow, the amount of air deflected over the surface, thus increasing the lift that it produces. But as we increase that angle of attack, we're also repositioning this resultant. We're kind of moving this resultant vector back because as we point this arrow back, this induced drag vector is also being allowed to expand this way as well. So like Lee was saying, you know, we're talking about vector addition where the resultant force is the sum between it's broken up into these components of the vertical and the horizontal component right here. And as this resultant moves back, we see it moves back as a result of right, of the vertical component moving, but also the horizontal component moving back as well. As that horizontal component moves back, that horizontal component being this induced drag, it's pulling that resultant vector back. And so we have here the relationship between the change in angle of attack, the resultant force as a result of that change in angle of attack, and the elongation of this horizontal component that we call induced drag. And it's so it's go ahead.
Yeah, so I couldn't get that document moved over, but I have an idea. So
Okay.
Let's see if we can make this work. We're going to take your thing off the screen for a second.
Sure.
And I've just drawn on my iPad here. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
That's all I really wanted to show. So
Nice.
All you see happening here is that if we have more lift, right, you see the dotted line increasing, then we have more drag, right? That's obvious. That's how vectors work. So just very simply, if you visualize it this way, it doesn't have to be like a weird mythical monster. It's just easy math. It's like, okay, that line's bigger, so we just create more drag because of how those forces interact. And the forces interacting, now that's a whole different story. I mean, we could go into equations and do this kind of like, there's these different angles of attack that we have to define. And sure, we can dive into that, but not today. So let's keep moving here.
Sure.
And we'll hop back over to you, Phil, because that's all I really wanted to throw in there. Again, just coming back to this real quick. Phil was talking about tilting that line, right? So if we tilt the line, obviously we create more drag as well. So we know that more angle of attack means more lift because we're diverting the airflow more aggressively. So all of this is staged in, right? Divert airflow more aggressively, bigger pressure difference, more lift, more drag. And that's essentially how airplanes, how they fly. It's just everything has a price.
Definitely. Let's pop back over to a really cool YouTube video that I found that I love to show when I'm talking about aerodynamics. And again, I'm trying to have this recurring theme be around, you know, what does lift look like? And we're starting to now get into induced drag and what induced drag looks like. When we produce lift, when we have high angles of attack, extreme low pressures and very high loads on the aircraft, we like we're saying, we have extremely low pressures over the surfaces of this over this wing. And the thing that's interesting about pressure and temperature is that they're related to each other. So in this way, as this F-16 pilot goes to pull up very aggressively, he's going to pull back in, pull that stick into his lap. The angle of attack is going to increase sharply. What we're going to see is the lift increasing insanely. And as the lift increases, we see this cloud forming over the upper surface of the wing due to that pressure being so low and the amount of lift that he's producing being so great, right? That lift being a result of that decrease in pressure. We see all of this airflow that's going over. Look, there's a wingtip vortice right there, actually, as a result of the lift. This decrease in pressure brings the temperature down over the wing to the dew point, and forms this cloud over the wing. There we're actually looking at lift in real time. We could also see an example of a computer changing the leading edge as well of the airfoil. You can see some flexion right there, and we also see some of the wingtip vortices off of this F-16. That's kind of a nice segue. What we're looking at, this wingtip vortice. Let's give that a shot. So yeah, you wanna kind of give like an intro to wingtip vortices. Actually,
I have a fun little drawing.
Sure.
For this one too.
Do you want? Oh, there we go.
I have the power, Phil. I can take it away when I want.
Dude, you obviously have the power. You have the stuff in the room. That's full circle, dude.
All right, once this little picture populates, we'll get talking. Another simple picture here. There's a wing, and we're just looking at the end of the wing, the very edge. So
speaking of full circle.
So when we come to the edge here, let's focus on the middle, because I know I have cool spirals going on here, but let's not get distracted. I know you get distracted easily, Phil. All right, so we have some airflow coming over the airfoil here, depicted with our red line. And then what I'm showing here is what the airflow at the end wants to do, right? So like we talked about, we're creating a pressure difference here to where the air wants to come up here. The air wants to get to the top of the wing. That's what's creating lift. So at the end, what happens? Well, the wind does what it's going to do. It just circles around the wing. It says, okay, cool. And what ends up happening here is two things. It runs into this flow and disrupts it, and it ends up coming off the back in these little squirrely dews. And also in more aggressive scenarios, it'll actually create a downwash. It'll come down on the wing and do opposite of lift, is not what we want. It comes actually downward instead of what we want is up. So it's doing two things. It's disruption of flow and also a little bit of a downforce that we don't like. And these are called wingtip vortices. And vortices is just the plural form of a vortex, right? A vortex being some kind of spiral. So as you can see, there's spiraling air coming off the back, and that's how we're calling this a wingtip vortice. It's not a magical word either. It's just a vortex from a wingtip. And we'll throw it back over to Phil because he's not as simple as me. He's got the good stuff. Let's see.
All right. Awesome.
Man.
Yeah, we're good. All right. So back to what Lee was to build off of what Lee was talking about. So I'm over here in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, which is where, Lee and I and, any instructor should get their information from that they give to you. It's not stuff that we're making up. We're all learning and we're trying to find better ways of explaining things, all the time. We're even trying to expand our own knowledge all the time. But really what it comes down to is making sure that you're giving information as accurately as you can. The information that we're getting from is here at this, the PHAK, the Pilot Handbook Aeronautical Knowledge. So looking at that, Chapter 7 or Chapter 5, page 7, we're over in the Induced Drag description. We see some pretty cool pictures. So, Lee, I know you like really fun pictures and cool colors and simple shapes.
Yeah.
So,
there's a vortex. It's
there's
a vortex spill.
How cool is that? Now, what's interesting about this is it looks like maybe a crop duster or something. It's hard to tell if it's a crop duster that's actually, you know, leaving something behind in its literal wake, and maybe this is the wingtip. I know I've seen wingtip vortices test before where they do a similar thing, but you know, no matter how we're looking at it, what we're looking at is off of this right wingtip, we're seeing counterclockwise motion, right? That the flow patterns are upward, or outward, upward, and rearward down the wing. And what we're looking at is the effect that is the cause of the high pressure seeking out low pressure. Let's see what else this says. Here's a simplified example of the counter-rotating vortices that rotate around the wing. We'll talk about ground effect at the end here in a few minutes, but what we're looking at here is a picture of wingtip vortices, again, as a result of the lift being generated, a result of the deflection of air and the disruption of equal pressure over the wing, right? This pressure differential over the wing. We see that these vortices are broken up because of the ground whenever the airplane's low to the ground. So we'll talk about that. Some other things about wingtip vortices before we get into some graphical depictions of them is that they descend. They're descending, counter-rotating columns of air. And let's see here. Right, the PHAC's got some nice rule of thumb guidelines. You know, living in the LA basin, we want to be aware of the wingtip vortices from, well, I mean, no matter where you live, you want to be aware of wingtip vortices. But really, you know, since we share the airspace with you know, a lot of large aircraft, you know, going in, whether that be in Long Beach or Van Nuys or John Wayne or Ontario, especially flying out to San Bernardino, right in the arrival path of aircraft in Ontario and LAX. We want to be aware of these wingtip vortices and wake turbulence behaviors that, you know, we can find in the PHAC. You know, you want to be a good distance away and understanding that they sink. So what you don't want to be is, you know, behind and below a large aircraft, especially close in. With that, let's take a look at some wingtip vortices. All right. So Lee, when what are we looking at here? What is the significance of this aircraft in particular? What is it about this aircraft that's producing wingtip vortices, and what would we expect should we inadvertently fly into them unknowingly, and maybe due to a lack of situational awareness of where that aircraft was? What type of aircraft is, you know, what's that?
He disappeared into the clouds and I couldn't see what kind of airplane it is. I was like, what the hell are you talking about? There's no airplane there.
Yeah, all I see is a handlebar mustache. Yeah, so no, this aircraft that's going to show up right here. What's significant? The fact that this thing is huge. Like, why does that matter?
Well, I mean, it's all about balance, right? So we have a big heavy thing needs more lift. It's that simple. The big heavy thing needs more lift. So what is he doing? He's trying to create more lift. And what do we create when we create more lift? We already talked about this. We create induced drag. Okay. And the induced drag, what's that created from? Well, it's created from these wingtip vortices. So boom, there's these big old wingtip vortices. Totally. Now, there are things that are also included in creating more lift. Like, we're heavy, we're what's called, actually, we shouldn't get into that. Hold on. We're heavy, and we're slow, right? We're slow because we're trying to create more lift. And that those two things are kind of the main things that's what happening here. We're heavy, creating more lift. We're slow, we got to create more lift. So we're creating more circulation and flow from those vortices. Gotcha.
So the need to produce more lift, just by virtue of it being humongous, means that there's probably going to be a proportional strength to these vortices. That, in other words, we shouldn't be worried about an aircraft of our comparable size and the vortices that, flying behind a smaller sling, we're not going to die from these vortices. We are of a comparable
Right.
size. The weight of the aircraft is comparable. The amount of lift is comparable. And, the inertia, or I should say, like the the size and the weight of our aircraft will be unhindered by the wingtip vortices of a similar aircraft. For example, like the 737 right here, or 747s, they fly in each other's wake all the time, and you don't see them falling out of the sky for the same exact reason. Going back to
Right.
the
Yeah.
did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, just real quick, what we try to do in these scenarios is we try to stay above or not right behind the aircraft, right? If we're below and behind the aircraft, that's where the vortice is going. It's like drifting behind and coming down. So we're trying to stay away from that area, and that's really the mitigation.
Right? This is kind of what Lee's talking about, is like, if we're taking off here behind this aircraft, we want to take off before, we want to note where the aircraft rotated, where the aircraft started taking off, understanding that the wingtip vortices and the wake turbulence is going to be behind and descending. We want to take off before the point where they took off, and climb out at probably a VX kind of pitch attitude, at least initially, to get above that descending wake and the descending wingtip vortices. Similarly, we want to land beyond where they landed. Right? If they're leaving all this turbulence behind them, we want to stay above and ahead of that flow and that all that turbulence. So that's a great point. Very, very invaluable, especially when operating in the LA basin. Going back to the F-16 here, we watched this F-16 video. Oh my God, that's another great video, Death Valley Days. Guys, go watch that. Death Valley Days 4K. Good Lord. Anyways.
On topic, Phil.
On topic. We're going back to the F-16, and here's another vision of another site of those wingtip vortices that we saw coming off of the wingtips. We've got a model in a wind tunnel, scale model, and just a really cool picture of these vortices that have that outward, upward, and rearward flow pattern, that left wing being the clockwise version. So, and we really are seeing, isn't that a really cool display though, of air being deflected at the same time as well? I mean, look at that high angle of attack for this guy.
Yeah, I want some of those lights.
Dude, I'm all about that. Exactly, that green laser situation, dude. That'd be sick. Okay. Finally, let's close up this discussion on keeping going with so far. Let's recap. So we talked about lift basics. We talked about the role of angle of it, what angle of attack is, the role of angle of attack, and both the generation of lift and the generation of induced drag, and where that induced drag comes from. Right? We said that it comes from a couple different ways of thinking about it. We said that it comes from the meeting of airflow patterns above the wing and below the wing, meeting at the trailing edge, trying to equalize, but also aerodynamically, it is represented as a vector, as one of two components of the resultant lift that's produced from an airfoil flying through the air, right? We've got the vertical component of lift and the horizontal component, which in terms of the airfoil is the induced drag, right? And as that angle of attack increases, that resultant vector tilts back because that induced drag vector elongates and pulls the resultant lift back. Okay, so that's the relationship between angle of attack. We looked between angle of attack and induced drag. Then we looked at these wingtip vortices, and we looked at the behavior of induced drag from an airflow standpoint, looked at wingtip vortices and the circular nature of them. We looked at some examples of what wingtip vortices look like and how to safely navigate around aircraft that all things producing lift produce wingtip vortices, including helicopters. But we got to be having that situational awareness around large aircraft that are producing them. Finally, let's talk about ground effect, and we'll end the discussion here. But it's an effect of induced drag behaving certain ways close to the ground. So Lee, while I pull it up here in the PHAC, can you speak a little bit to what ground effect is, and maybe a couple different situations that it would affect a student pilot directly, or any pilot for that matter. But I mean,
yeah,
particularly, you know.
Yeah. So ground effect, and we talked about this a little bit. I think we were doing our Star Wars thing when we were close to the ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ground effect, that's where we're seeing it, is when we're close to the ground. And let me just modify one of my drawings real quick, and it won't take too long.
Nice.
Just get rid of this. Really, what's happening here, I'll try to multitask and keep you guys, keep some sound in your ears, because I know people get really weird with silence.
Yeah, what's up with that?
I'm just kidding.
We're all gonna.
So when we get close to the ground, what we're doing is we're dissipating some of the flow from these vortexes. So, and it's really simple for me to modify this. I got to get my colors right, though. Colors are really important to me. Okay. So essentially, when we get close to the ground here, maybe I'll draw some grass, because we're going to land on a grass strip. Grass. Okay.
Nice.
Okay. Now we're close to the ground. Okay. So let's go here. Get some of this. So here we go. I got my little drawing modified a little bit here. So as you can see, instead of those arrows going up, right? I hope you guys can see okay here.
Yeah, it looks good.
Instead of the arrows going up, they hit the ground and kind of go out. So when you're close to the ground, the airflow, instead of kind of circling around and having the ability to get on top, it actually hits the ground and gets dissipated by it. That's the simple discussion of it. All it is like, instead of the airflow being able to circle around on this long path, it just comes down and hits the ground, and instead of going back up, it just kind of like dissipates out to the side.
Definitely. We see that really, you know, everybody knows that learning to land is the hardest part, and we really see that with you know, coming in for a landing maybe with too much energy, or as we are trying to seek perfection in our short field landings, we see ground effect as hopefully evolving from the enemy and a nuisance to a tool that we can actually use to carry us to where we need to go, you know. But it's definitely experienced, especially coming into to land with a lot of energy. You know, it's no surprise that as you come in with a lot of energy, and those flow patterns that are normally holding the airplane back and contributing to a lot of that drag that allows the plane to decelerate when you reduce power and you know, things that we're used to, when those flow patterns are interrupted by the ground, you just don't have that anything holding us back. You know, to return to our central theme of what's holding us back, in ground effect, nothing's holding us back, you know, until we leave ground effect, and then we see something, you know, now all of a sudden angle of attack is, you know, is the same angle of attack that we need to maintain the same a given amount of lift is a different angle of attack now that we have more holding us back, right? As we leave ground effect, we have induced drag kick in, airflow patterns around the wingtips of the wing are circulating, and you know, we're potentially surprised by that. Don't leave ground effect too soon.
Cool.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to
I liked your idea of the
ground effect in terms of your screen, or are we gonna?
Yeah, no. Oh yeah.
The infinite wing?
Yeah, the infinite wing. Let's do it. We'll like end this on a thought experiment. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of introduced this in the beginning. If anybody wasn't here during that, this is the infinite wing monster that is fabled in all aviation mythology, and essentially, my thought experiment on this is, if induced drag is being created by wingtip vortices, if the wing never ends, then do we have any induced drag? I mean,
yeah,
if the wing just keeps going, do we create it? So, Phil, did you have anything that you wanted to kind of dive in on that one about?
I think it's just like such an interesting question, because we never would have thought of that. You know, of course a wing ends. It's like, yeah, but what if it didn't? You know, like if we know about And they're like, yeah, but it does. It's like, yeah, but what if it didn't? Yeah, but it does, you know? No, like, it's an interesting thought experiment. If wingtip vortices are responsible for the induced drag that hold a wing back, and if you essentially were creating a lift from a wing that had no wingtips because it went on forever, I would think that you would have no induced drag, that you would have an infinite amount of parasitic drag, though. That's the thing about that. You'd have an infinite amount of parasitic drag just by virtue of the fact that this wing would go on forever, and it would, you know, the form would be infinite. Whatever that even means, you know, the form would be infinite. You'd have an infinite amount of you know, imperfections in the skin that stats would just go insane to talk about. You know, you need some calculus to talk about all the number of, like, you know, skin imperfections and stuff like that. Parasitic drag would be infinitely positive, but induced drag, I think, would be 0, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. And so I did some drawing to deal with that too, because, you know, I love drawing. So I hope this is populating correctly, because as always, my screen's acting weird. Okay, so here we go. I'll zoom in physically here. So we have essentially a few different types of wings that I've drawn. All right, here's one. This guy over here, he's got a triangle-looking wing, and then we got like a rectangle-looking wing, and then this bottom guy's kind of got this little thing sticking out the top. Okay, so I've drawn the different airflow patterns of these. We'll talk about the top two for now. So we have a triangular wing, or what's called a swept wing. And you can see at the end there, it has a point. So there's not as much airflow that wants to swing on top versus the rectangular wing that kind of wants to swing on top, right? If the wing was infinite, like our little discussion, then nothing would swing to the top, right? Obviously, there's benefits, drawbacks to all these. But the last thing I want to talk about, if we come down to the bottom one, this is what's called a winglet, which is essentially just a little upward portion of the wing. And as I get closer here, you can see very simply, all this is doing is blocking airflow from going down on top of the wing. If we come back to our rectangular wing, you see at the end, the airflow comes directly down and creates a problem. This is basically alleviating that problem. So this is a perfect opportunity for us now. I hope the focus is going to get better.
It looked good. Focus. No, yeah.
Yeah, the focus is just weird now.
Okay,
let me move back.
So yeah, the camera can't handle how sick your room is, dude. I'm with it. I just yeah.
Now I'm in blurry world. No, I can do all sorts of stuff you guys won't know.
Totally.
So this is a perfect segue for us to go into the next type of drag, which is kind of cerebral, I'll say, because it's wave drag. It's something that we as general aviators don't see a lot, but it's the other type of drag. They say in the book there's three types of drag. And so we're going to go into that one next time. We'll talk a little bit more about the different shapes of the wings and why they're swept back, and the efficiency on that. You know, like why do our slings have more rectangular wing? We'll go through all of that, and then we'll also dive into this kind of wave drag thing, which is kind of cool concept that I really want to get into because I think it's fun.
Cool. That sounds like a plan. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for having me on again, Lee, and everybody for tuning in. You guys are great, and I hope you guys are staying safe in quarantine.
Oh, look, the focus got it. Hi.
Focus, Lee.
I'm focused, I swear. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks, Phil, for talking with us. We'll definitely have you on next week again to talk more about drag, and hopefully we'll see the rest of you there too.
Sounds good, man. See you then.